Currently, Mr. Painter is president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation. Previously, he was the commissioner for the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. He's a board member of the Center for Internet Security, a former William J. Perry Fellow and lecturer at Stanford University in California, the coordinator for cyber issues for the US Department of State, a former US cyber diplomat between 2011 and 2017. Mr. Painter was the senior director for cybersecurity for the White House National Security Staff in the US. At the US Department of Justice, Mr. Painter was Deputy Assistant Director for the FBI Cyber Division, and before that, Principal Deputy Chief for Computer Crime and the Intellectual Property Section. Mr. Painter was an associate at Arnold and Porter, and he has a background in US cyber diplomacy. He's a founding father of the field as such. And with that, I'm hugely excited to yield the floor to you, Mr. Painter. Very keen to hear your lecture on ransomware. In fact, let me also pull up the PDF which you sent me and enter screen sharing mode so that it will be visible for everyone.
Great, thanks. And it's really good to be with all of you here today, and to be on this this call with you. This ransomware is a big topic. I'll put it in some into some context. As was said, I've been doing cybersecurity various cybersecurity issues for about 31 years now, so for a long time, and started dealing with this as a cybercrime prosecutor back in the 90s, dealing with hacking and other cases, then moved to the Maine Justice Department, doing a lot of these cases and international aspects of them, then to the White House, and then finally to the State Department. So I've seen different aspects of cybercrime and cybersecurity more generally. But I think ransomware, if we can go to that, past the title slide, if you can scroll up to that first slide, Adam. There. I think, as we look at ransomware is obviously a form of cybercrime, but I think it is particularly pernicious. When we look at the different actors in cyberspace, the bad actors, there are nation states, certainly, who cause lots of disruptions, often in it for espionage. There are criminal groups, including transnational criminal groups, and they're in it for the money. Then there's hacktivists and there's others. Cyber criminals have been around for a very long time. I mean, I've been doing that I started doing that 30 years ago, and they've certainly been around, and there's different sophistications of cyber criminals, everything from really organized criminal groups to just lone gunman hackers, as I call it. But ransomware, I think, has changed the game in many ways. As we look at cybercrime, as I said, it's been around, in countries like the Netherlands and the US and India have all taken it seriously, but it hasn't been as much as a political priority as it needs to be. And I think that ransomware has changed that really in the past couple of years. So to give you a concept of what ransomware is doing, I mean, ransomware, just to describe what ransomware is a criminals or a criminal group, and it's often a criminal group, break into your computer or the computer of a hospital or of a small business or a large business or even a government, and they encrypt. They use tools to get into that computer like they would for other purposes, stolen tools, or they hack into the computer, and they essentially encrypt all the data on that computer, and they send a message to the victim saying, unless you pay us a certain large amount of money by a certain amount of time, you'll never get that back. And not only will you never get it back, so there's a dual aspect of this, we're going to also start releasing that data to the public, or release it to your competitors, or release it in sensitive areas. So So the victim is forced to confront two things: business interruption. Their business or even the government can't work because they don't have any access to files, and also extortion, that their data might be exposed to the public or to competitors or to other governments. And so it really is a two kind of pronged crime. The way it differs from traditional cybercrime, which is often involved the theft of either secrets or financial information like credit cards or just money, is that those you may not notice they even happen for a while. If someone breaks into your computer and steals a lot of your information, you may not know until years later that it was stolen, when you start seeing it being used by that criminal group or someone that criminal group is sold to. With ransomware, it's immediately apparent because you can't operate your computers. And this could have a devastating effect on businesses, including critical businesses like hospitals, schools, critical infrastructure, local police, small businesses, large corporations. To give you an example of one ransomware event just a year ago, was the DC, Washington DC's police. They had a ransomware event where the person, both like they normally do, encrypted all the data, demanded they be paid a large sum of money through cryptocurrency, which is usually the way the ransomware actors ask for money because it's harder to trace. And then when the police didn't pay them, started releasing very sensitive police files, including arrest information, warrants, wiretap information, all of that stuff. And that could really be a threat to public safety. So that's just one example. So what we've seen is the average downtime, and this is in this first chart, the average downtime from a ransomware attack has been 23 days. The average days it takes a business to fully recover is almost a year, 287 days. And victims paid in ransomware in 2020, now this is a little old, the statistic, $692 million. Now, $692 million, I'd say, is a vast underestimate of the actual amount that was paid, because many, many, many people don't report these crimes for reasons we'll talk about a little later. And so we don't know the full scope of the problem. So this is probably just a small fraction of the payments that victims make. And often the victims feel forced to pay because, again, they can't operate their business or their school or their hospital or even their local government. The average payment in 2021 was $570,000. So that's not an insignificant amount of money, especially for a small business or a municipality. So we've seen in the U.S. alone, 2,300 local governments, healthcare facilities, and schools be the victims of ransomware. Go to the next, scroll up to the next slide, please. Okay. So this is not just a problem that's localized in any particular country, or including in the U.S. It's true that U.S. There are many victims in the U.S., but there are victims all over the world. And attacks against, for instance, global software supply chains increased 300%, and they're targeting open source. The way they get into these systems, the way they get into the hospital and the other systems, is they target what we call open source vulnerabilities, ones that are known but not patched yet. They are attacking widely used open source software. They're manipulating the build process itself to create vulnerabilities. They're being very sophisticated. Scroll up to the next slide, please. And to give you a sense of the scope of the problem, we did this slide back a year ago, and we updated the slide just this year, the Ransomware Task Force, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And you can see it's not just the U.S., although the U.S. has a major concentration of reported cases, but India also is a major victim, and the Netherlands is a major victim. So, and Brazil and Australia. So this is not localized to any one place, and it is a growing problem. Next, scroll up, please. So in response to this problem, as I said, cybercrime's been around a long time. Often governments prioritize nation-state activity, like big hacking events. But ransomware was costing, not just money, but disrupting businesses, disrupting government. And it was an issue that wasn't being given enough priority. And so the Ransomware Task Force was a group of 60 plus experts from really all over the map. I was one of the co-chairs of the ransomware task force. I'm a former government person, and now I run the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation, which is a global cyber capacity building group that is actually co-chaired by India and the Netherlands. But we had people from industry, we had people from the cyber insurance industry and the insurance industry at large, civil society, international organizations, a real widespread of folks, because you really need that expertise to understand. So that included incident responders, healthcare entities, cryptocurrency, which is, they said, the way of choice for these people to act, international law enforcement like Europol and organizations like that, financial regulators. Really, this is a multi-faceted problem, not just because of the cybercrime itself, but also the payment methods, which I said were cryptocurrency, the international implications, and also the victims. We met for 4 months, an intense process where we created a set of recommendations. And one of the things I said when I signed on to this effort is that I didn't want this to be shelfware. In other words, I didn't want to work on a report that would sit on someone's shelf and never be paid attention to. And we issued our report in April of 2021. And we've continued to work for the report, trying to design initiatives, which we'll talk about in a moment, and counter the spread of ransomware, working with governments, the private sector, and others around the world. Slide up to the next slide, please. So one thing I'd say before I launch into what the Ransomware Task Force tried to do is that, it didn't become shelfware. It actually became very much used, because, as we'll talk about later, 1 week after issuing our ransomware report with literally dozens of very actionable recommendations for governments and private sector and victims to take, there was a big ransomware event in the US called the Colonial Pipelines attack. So Colonial Pipelines is a provider of gas and fuel in the Southeast United States, and it was hit with a ransomware attack. And so Colonial Pipelines, took their computers offline because they were worried about how it would affect their operations. And that shut down the fuel distribution system for much of the Southeast United States. And what that resulted in was it becoming a huge political issue, because, when cyber criminals are stealing information, when nation states are engaged in espionage, people care about it, but the ordinary person doesn't really care that much about it. They care if their money's stolen, but if it's reimbursed by the bank, they don't care that much. They certainly care about their personal data being stolen. But they care a lot more, as they did in this case, when they had to wait in line for gas. So they were worried about getting it. There was another attack on JB Health System, which is a meat processor. So they were worried about getting their hamburger. There was an attack on the Irish healthcare system, and so they were worried about getting their health insurance. So this really made it an issue, what we call in the U.S. a breadbasket issue, an issue the ordinary person cares about. And that, I think, elevated it, catapulted it to a political issue in a way that no other cybersecurity or cybercrime thing had happened before. So back to the Ransomware Task Force. The basic framework was along 4 pillars. 1, deterring ransomware attacks. 2, disrupting the ransomware business models. I said this is a for-money enterprise. Often these are organized criminal groups, almost always organized criminal groups. They even offer ransomware as a service, so you don't have to be that smart or sophisticated to be a ransomware actor if you're part of one of these groups. 3, help organizations prepare for ransomware attacks. And 4, respond to ransomware attacks more effectively across the board by governments. Go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned, I started going into this, and I'll go into more directly, but it's been used against critical infrastructure extensively, which is the most serious sort of attacks I think we've seen. Obviously we care and the victims care if you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, but when it used against critical infrastructure, it has widespread effects on everyone, because critical infrastructure is called critical infrastructure for a reason. It's critical. You need that. You need to have it. You need to use it. So I mentioned the Colonial Pipelines attack. That was key. But also the health sector was substantially impacted in 2022. And that was right in 2021 and 2022, right at the height of the pandemic. We saw ransomware going after hospitals, going after research facilities. And you can imagine with all the problems we had with the pandemic and continue to have to some extent, that ransomware targeting that kind of critical infrastructure just magnified the problem. It was just completely unacceptable. Slide up to the next slide. So against this, I want to talk about something that's going on the kind of the world stage in the policy arena. So, and how ransomware fits into this. So when you talk about ransomware in terms of what it is, even when it's criminal groups, and sometimes it's nation states, but it's almost always criminal groups. Sometimes they're operating under the cover of a state. In other words, either the country is turning a blind eye to their activity, and this has been a problem in ransomware. A lot of the ransomware groups operate from Russia, and because they operate from Russia, it's been very difficult to get them because Russia maybe doesn't promote their activity, doesn't tell them to do it, but at the same time doesn't really stop them. And so they provide a safe haven to them. So one way to look at this in terms of how you deal with ransomware is what has already been agreed to more generally. And within the UN framework, there's a framework for what's called responsible state behavior in cyberspace, a number of norms of behavior, voluntary rules of the road. Every country in the world has agreed to these rules. And so you look at, these include international law, confidence building measures, which is called confidence building measures. How do you practically coordinate and cooperate, and norms related to critical infrastructure and state behavior. Go to the next slide. So briefly, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but I think some of those norms cross over and apply in a ransomware instance. When ransomware is targeting critical infrastructure, which, as I said, we've seen frequently in the US and really around the world, that there is one of these UN norms that says no country in peacetime should attack the critical infrastructure of another country, and no country should allow, should use other groups to do this. So countries have a responsibility not to do that, and the U.S. has designated 16 critical infrastructure. I'm not sure how many India has or the Netherlands has, but clearly things like fuel pipelines, financial systems, or others are covered. Go to the next slide. Another one of the things that the UN and every country has agreed to, that if one country makes a request to another country, they should, about malicious ICT or cyber acts, they should respond and help mitigate those threats. If it's coming from their territory, they should do something about this. This is called due diligence. Go to the next slide. So just back on that due diligence one, so for instance, if you have ransomware actors in your country who are attacking other countries or targets in other countries, you have some obligation to act. We haven't always seen that happen. That's that safe haven issue I talked about. And then internationally, generally, there's been a number of responses to ransomware. There is an annex to the General Assembly resolution that talks about promoting partnerships between stakeholders to protect critical infrastructure, conduct this coalesces with a ransomware task force. I told you we had a number of recommendations. One was to conduct a sustained, aggressive, public-private, collaborative anti-ransomware campaign. So that is an international campaign. It's just not one country, it's every country working on it. And that's something we've seen over the past year since we released the report. And a greater exchange of information to understand and address cybersecurity threats. Next one. And another one of these things that was agreed in the UN is how states could cooperate and exchange information about threats. And certainly ransomware is one of the ones that would fit within that. And again, we're trying to, not just the task force, but countries are trying to move in that direction. Go to the next slide. So I want to talk about some of the international responses we've seen, but I'd also say that shortly after we issued the report, and I said that it became a big issue around the world. I mean, people recognized how big an issue it was when the Colonial Pipelines attack happened, and that caused a lot of attention around the world, and that was really important. That attention is critically important, including the launch of an international ransomware task force at a political level by the White House, of which the Netherlands and India are both members. And they had a meeting a year ago. They just had another meeting. I'll talk more about that. But there are different parts of the international responses that we want to talk about. One is the law enforcement response. So, dismantling these ransomware groups, which are transnational, they're all over, they're often in countries where it is difficult to reach them. So there's been a number of joint operations that have targeted and arrested some of the ransomware actors. Now, the problem is there's lots of these ransomware groups, and you cannot always get to all of them, so it's tough to do that. But there has been a lot of activity to actually target these groups. Go to the next slide. On a political level, and I want to spend a little time on this, right after the Colonial Pipelines incident, shortly after the Ransomware Task Force issued its report, and just talking more about the Ransomware Task Force report, I told you we broke it into 4 pillars. So one pillar was talking about what you need to do to protect yourself better, and that's not different than what you do in almost every other kind of cyber incident, but how can you protect your systems? Cyber hygiene was really important, basic cyber hygiene, which was lacking here, but that's true for like any cyber crime or cybersecurity. How victims could maybe have playbooks ready available, so when they're hit by a ransomware attack, they know what to do rather than just being scrambling, which they often do. Have a portal that's set up by the government to allow better understanding of what tools are out there, because sometimes you don't have to pay the ransom. The keys, the decryption keys that will allow you to recover your data exist, and you can use them. There's one called No More Ransom, which is hosted by Europol, which is very good. There are a number of other ones. So that's the kind of working with the private sector and helping make sure they're ready. There was another sector, which I talked about, deterring and disrupting, and that's the law enforcement approaches, but it's also making sure that you have a very senior, high-level response. I said ransomware was generally not treated as a big enough issue and given priority, but really making it an issue at a leader level, at a ministerial level, that was important as well. And we had a number of recommendations about how you could do that and how you could take that up. So, some of those responses were the G7 met shortly after a report came out, and the G7 was a very crowded agenda of climate change and Ukraine and lots of other things. Well, not Ukraine at that point, but climate change, energy crises, financial crises, and ransomware was added to the agenda because it was so important. And so that was discussed there. It was discussed in what's called the Quad Ministerial that involves India and the U.S. as well. It was discussed at a number of these high-level forums, and there were statements that came out of it saying how important this was. We had technical and policy POCs established for like computer emergency response team to computer emergency response team collaboration. There were a number of policy-making events, including go to the next slide, including the ransomware task force, the international ransomware task force I mentioned that was set up by the White House. So the White House set up this international task force that involved 36 countries for a meeting in the White House almost a year ago today. And they came together and they issued a communique, which was I think very helpful. And in that communique, they talked about the nature of the things they needed to do to collaborate together to go after ransomware, and in fact, do it in a more effective way, and set up working groups to deal with that. And just in the last couple of days, at the end of last year, the Ransomware Task Force met again in DC, all those 36 countries, again, including India and including the Netherlands and the US and many, many others, and issued another communique, another statement where they talked about the importance of the importance of ransomware and fighting ransomware more generally. And I think that was a really important statement that they had to that they came up with, which I think was incredibly useful for this area and how they collaborate in the future. Now, getting 36 countries to agree on anything is very difficult, but at the same time, it was important to issue that statement. And one of the things that they plan to do is to create a more operational ransomware international task force that's going to be created, and also trying to work with the private sector in the next year. So that's really important. In the US, there's been a number of activity that has been pursued to address ransomware issues. I talked about the payment plan of choice for ransomware actors is cryptocurrency. And and maybe I'll just go through some of the priority recommendations that we had in the task force a year ago and how some of these efforts that we see now are measuring up. So one recommendation was that we needed to execute a sustained, aggressive, whole-of-government, intelligence-driven anti-ransomware campaign. And domestically for the US, that meant getting our act together, getting all the different agencies to not just do this piecemeal, but to put it together in a coordinated way and have an integrated US government joint ransomware task force. Now, what the US government did is the Department of Homeland Security set up a task force, the Department of Justice set up a task force, the White House set up a task force, so that sounds like a lot of task forces, but there was coordination among them, and that's been effective. Another of our priority recommendations in our ransomware task force report, which can be found on the website of the Institute for Security and Technology, is along with some updates to that report, including a report we did updating what's happened in the past year for you to look at. And I think that's at www.ist.org, is continued international, diplomatic, and law enforcement efforts to proactively prioritize ransomware through a comprehensive resource strategy, including using carrot and stick approaches to direct nation states away from providing safe havens. So I mentioned that many countries provide safe havens, unfortunately, not many, but several, including Russia. So how do we deal with that? Well, one is there are countries who do it because they don't have the capability to go after those actors. So for those countries, we have to help them build cyber capacity. We have to provide them the tools to actually do that, to do things like joint investigations, to go after these groups. The countries who are turning a blind eye and don't care, we have to pressure them. We have to use more of the stick. We have to figure out how we can do it. Now, as you all, I think many of you know, one of the things that happened last year before the Ukraine war started was there was a high-level summit between President Biden and President Putin, where ransomware was front and center as an issue because a lot of these groups, as I said, operated in Russia. And Biden said, look, we don't want any attacks on our critical infrastructure, enough of this, and we need you to do something about these groups. Maybe it's not you. I'm not saying it's you as a government in Russia, but you're allowing this to happen, and you know what's happening in Russia, so you should go after them. And we did see some activity. Russia actually arrested some of these ransomware actors, but that was just at the time that they were invading the Ukraine, and so I don't think that cooperation ever panned out, and there was no more activity taken to go after those groups yet. And we've actually seen some of those ransomware groups in the context of the Ukrainian conflict using ransomware against Ukrainian targets, and we've seen people who are on the other side of that targeting some of these ransomware groups. So there's been a lot of activity there, but that was one of the important priority recommendations. We also wanted governments to establish cyber response and recovery funds to support victims and mandate that organizations report all ransomware payments. Now, one of the problems we've seen in this space is that you could not get people. We debated, the one thing we couldn't agree on in the ransomware task force is whether or not we should recommend banning payments. Why should you pay these criminals? It's just making it so they'll do it more. But the problem with that is you victimize the victims. Let's say it's a small hospital and they get shut down by ransomware, and you say it's a crime to pay that ransom when that's maybe the only way that they can get their systems back online. That's not really sustainable. So we couldn't agree as a task force on that, a year ago. But what we said is, if you pay the ransom, you should report it. And indeed, in the U.S. now, there's a new reporting law for critical infrastructure. It doesn't apply to everyone, but for critical infrastructure, that if you get attacked, you have to report it. And if you pay, you have to report it. And they're still working out the details of that, but I think that's certainly something that, to get a better sense of the scope of the problem and how we're responding is important. And then, I talked about creating a framework for victim organizations. There's been some good work done on that as well. But one key thing was cryptocurrency. And so the cryptocurrency sector, as I said, if I'm a ransomware criminal, I say pay in cryptocurrency, because then it's harder for law enforcement to trace it, and you can go through several different ways of laundering that money. So there's a lot of debate. So what do you do about this? Cryptocurrency is used for good things, it's used for bad things. So how can you get a handle on this? And what we suggested is that the cryptocurrency system, which requires the cryptocurrency providers, the exchanges, the kiosks, all of these things should be subject, just like any other financial system, to existing know your customer regulations and any money laundering regulations and laws. And so that's not just a domestic thing either. That's international. We have to work together, just like we do with money laundering, to go after that. We're not banning cryptocurrency, but we're making sure it's being used in a correct way. And I say in the US, the Treasury Department has been very active in a couple of things. One, they've issued guidance saying that if you pay ransomware to an entity that is on the on the ban list because they're a terrorist or other organization, you could be liable. So that creates, I think, some risk for people who want to pay ransomware. Also, they have gone after and sanctioned some of these cryptocurrency providers, not the providers themselves, but the exchanges, the wallets, etc. So I think that is saying that we're going to take more of a regulatory view here. There's been some good law enforcement activity where the FBI has been able to recoup some of the losses from some of the incidents through cryptocurrency by using law enforcement investigatory powers. So that's been good. So crypto remains a real big problem, and it continues to be discussed. So there's been, as I said, just a huge amount of developments in just the year since we put out this report. The Treasury sanctions and guidance, cooperation, a little bit of cooperation with Russia, but that didn't go anywhere, but a lot of cooperation among other countries in the world to prioritize this, to resource it, and to have a sustained effort. It has to be sustained. You can't just do this for a month or even a year. You have to keep on top of this because it's not going away, and it's continuing to be very disruptive. And reporting, all those things are really important. The G7 statement, the Quad statement, continued leader level statements and ministerial level statements are important. The Ransomware International Task Force is important. I will read you a couple comments from that White House statement that was a joint statement of all those 36 countries that was just issued last week. And one of the things they said they want to do is hold ransomware actors accountable for their crimes and not provide safe havens. They want to combat ransomware actors' ability to profit from illicit proceeds through enforcing anti-money laundering and know your customer rules on cryptocurrency. They want to disrupt and bring to justice ransomware actors. So this mirrors the recommendations our ransomware task force made. They want to collaborate with the private sector. And this is really important because it's not just the governments. They have to work with the private sector to do this, which is why our task force was created that included all these different actors. And they want to really, I think, enhance the combat against ransomware by creating tools, issuing reports over the next year, improving global cyber hygiene, and public-private partnerships. The Ransomware Task Force hasn't been sitting still either. So a lot of government activity is happening, both in the US as elsewhere, which is what we wanted, which is what the Ransomware Task Force wanted, because we've now called attention to this problem. But we have, like I said, assessed where things were a year later in our report, which is on the website I mentioned. We also created a blueprint for ransomware defense, which is very valuable for victims and potential victims to look at things they might need to do, including using what are some basic cyber hygiene. There's tools. There's a organization in the U.S. called the Center for Internet Security. I'm on the board of that group. That is a nonprofit that talks about cyber hygiene and a number of controls that if you follow those controls, you're taking care of about 85 to 90% of your problems. The Ransomware Task Force has also just recently issued a reporting template because sometimes the victims don't know what to report or what's relevant. And there's a lot of ongoing activity. So as we look at this field, I don't think ransomware is nearly going away. There was a debate a few months ago as whether it went down or went up. But as I said, we don't even know the full scope of the problem because it is such an underreported problem. And we do know it continues to be serious. So even if they're not going after critical infrastructure, which they continue are, they are going after hospitals, they are going after other things that have real effects on our society and citizens. So we need to pay attention. I've listed on this slide a number of resources. I can send, I'll send, Adam will have the links to these so he will share them with you. I know the slide, there are hot links on the slide, so that doesn't help you, but he'll get them to you. The blueprint, as I talked about, the advice for businesses, the Stop Ransomware site from the US. You can also do the No More Ransom site from Europol, a cybersecurity handbook for civil society organizations, a ransomware playbook from the Cyber Readiness Institute, a real wide variety of things that I think are useful both to victims, but also to people who are working in this area to go after and understand the scope of this problem. Now, as I said in the opening, ransomware is part of a larger challenge of cybercrime, which we also have to pay attention to. But I think ransomware, although it's sort of the new variant of cybercrime, it's like distributed denial of service attacks were a few years ago, it is a particularly damaging and disruptive one. It's one that I think deserves the priority that our governments are beginning to give it, but we need to make sure we're working, if you're in the government, working with the government, if you're not in the government, again, working with the government to make sure this doesn't become something that slides off the priority list and we don't pay attention, because the criminals will continue to pay attention whether we do or not. And we need to be ever vigilant and do more to cooperate internationally. This will continue to be an international issue with the perpetrators and the victims all over the world. And so there has to be really almost an unprecedented level of international cooperation on this. And it will clearly continue to affect India, the Netherlands, and the US, and many other countries. So with that, Adam, I thought I would pause and open it up for questions from folks. And I know I covered a lot of different things, so I'm happy to talk about anything within that.
Thank you so much, sir. We can now move on to the questions. If anyone in the audience had some observations or interjections or questions during the lecture, feel free to drop them in the chat. I did receive 2 questions in email from Akash. One of them is, sir, were there any instances of the victim organization having paid the ransom and harmful data being released anyway?
Yes, I mean, this is one of the things. This is one of the things that we've said to victims too. It's like there's no guarantee that when you pay the ransom, that you'll either get the key to decrypt your data, or that it will work, or that they won't continue to extort you. In fact, often criminals say, okay, well, they paid, so they're an easy mark. I'm going to go after you again. So that's a continuing challenge, I think, certainly. That the other thing is, one of the advices we give to victims is that you back up your data. You continue to back up your data so that if you get hit by ransomware, you can restore your systems at least to a certain point. Because even if you get the key from them after you pay the ransomware, it could take you a while to get back up and running even then. So that doesn't solve your issues either. And as I said, as the question noted, sometimes these are malicious actors. They get paid. That's what they're in the business for. But then sometimes they still release the information, or they sell the information because they can make more money from it. So, they're not ethical. They're willing to make money anywhere they come. And if your information is valuable, they'll still sell it even if they tell you they're not going to.
Thank you, sir. And from what I understand, Akash's other question is regarding what is the customary legal sentence for perpetrators of ransomware crime?
Well, it's relatively new, and often there haven't been a lot of enough arrests so far, and so a lot of those cases are still working their way through. If they were brought to justice in a U.S. court, it'd be based on the amount of damages and their criminal history. That's in any crime in the U.S. So it could be substantial. It could be years in prison for doing this. Unfortunately, as I said, there are lots of countries that are offering, or not a lot. There's a few countries that are offering safe havens or not doing anything about it, and those actors have acted with relative impunity. The cases, the kind of takedowns I talked about that happened, that the Dutch were involved in as well, where they took down a number of ransomware actors around the world. Those cases have not gone to trial yet or not been sentenced yet, so we'll see what that is. But I suspect, especially if they're going after critical infrastructure or a hospital, that's going to result in a longer sentence, and that's deserved.
Understood. Thank you, sir. On behalf of the student asking the question, Shreyas has a further one. Which antivirus companies provide solutions for ransomware, such as decryptors?
So, I'm not going to choose between particular commercial entities. There are a lot of, because this has become such a huge problem. I was at the big RSA cybersecurity conference a few months ago, and almost every vendor has a solution for ransomware now. So I don't know which ones are better than the others. There are some free things you can use too. Like I said, the No More Ransom site, both the No Ransom site in the U.S. and the No More Ransom that Europol runs, I think are very helpful. A number of folks are trying. I mean, the way ransomware actors get in the first place is they get in through the vulnerabilities that they do for anything else. So, a lot of the cybersecurity and antivirus products used to make sure your systems are secure help against ransomware too, because they take advantage of existing vulnerabilities to get in. And look, if I'm a cyber criminal, if your target is hard to get into, I'm not probably, unless I'm a nation state and I really want to get you, I'm going to move on to someone who's easier, right? So there's a lot of them out there now. So I wouldn't choose just one. And then I see another question about how do you improve attribution of ransomware, and is it ethical for a state to adopt ransomware as a weapon? So attribution is not as hard in ransomware as it is in some other areas. I'd argue attribution is sometimes overplayed in general cyber activity too, because especially on a really serious event, you can look at not just the digital footprints, you can figure out who's doing it. But on ransomware, they're sent, it's not just following the digital footprints, you're following the money too, and they often tell you who they are. So the problem is they're often hard to get to because they're, again, behind a shield of a country who's providing them protection. So, but that goes to the second part of the question. Is it ethical for states to adopt ransomware as a weapon? No. I think frankly that, I think there are issues with international law on that. There's these norms I talked about that were adopted in the UN. They're voluntary norms, to be sure, but they're political commitments. And, if you're using ransomware to attack the critical infrastructure of another country, that is a violation of the norm that all these countries have agreed to. So there's not, I don't think it's ethical to use ransomware as a weapon against another country, especially when you're not at war with that country.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for contributing to the IDCSS 22. I see one last question from Kamala Aswari. If that's okay, can we still cover it?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Do you see the chat?
Yeah.
So
okay. As we talk about organizational and international effects of ransomware, how do you think we should address individuals suffering with ransomware attacks? Well, it's a good question. So, obviously we have to care about everyone, and governments need to care about everyone. So they're going to prioritize critical infrastructure because that's going to affect everyone in the country. If the power goes down, it doesn't affect just the government people, it affects everyone. If you can't get fuel supplies, et cetera. So that's going to be a critical priority. But even ordinary citizens, and like I said, mom and pop businesses, small businesses that are attacked, we need to do work with them too. And part of that is that preparedness part. So even if they don't have any resources, giving them the tools they can use so they don't necessarily have to pay ransomware. Helping them with that, helping create a victim fund. That's something we've advocated that's one of our recommendations that haven't been taken up. So we can't forget the ordinary victim, just like we can't forget the ordinary victim of cybercrime. And I'd say it's important that even ordinary victims report these issues to law enforcement or to your cybersecurity agencies so there can be follow-up. I know in other areas that sometimes something looks like an isolated event. It's part of a larger, you might think, well, no one cares about my little event, but it turns out it's part of a larger scheme, and you will get a lot of interest. So it is important to deal with this problem across our society.
Thank you so much, sir. Are there any last questions in the audience? Oh, Kamali is thanking you. Well, either way, that wraps up the lecture then. Thank you so much again, sir, on behalf of HCSS, on behalf of DSCI, and on behalf of all our students. It's nearly 11 p.m. in India, but it's a testament to the urgency of the situation with ransomware and to your expert insights that so many of them joined either way.
I certainly appreciate it, and certainly India I've been to many times, and I hope to get to again soon. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir. And we hope to see you next year as well.
All right, great. Bye-bye.
Have a great evening, sir.
You too. Bye-bye.